This is TV Africa. We are here with renowned political activist and writer Angela Yvonne Davies. We're going to be having a short interview with her to share her insights on her work and what actually brings her to Ghana. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right. First of all, let's start with your trip to Ghana. Can you elaborate on the reasons for your visit?
Well, I was invited by Jane Cortez before she passed away. She and Ata Aidu were the co-presidents of the Organization of Women Writers of African Descent, and I was invited to participate in the Yari Yari and Tuaso conference. I participated in the first Yari Yari conference that took place in New York, and so I was very excited at the prospect of being able to travel to Ghana for the very first time.
Right. And, since you've been in Ghana, what has been your overview of the general, writing industry in the country?
Well, of course, I've only been here a few days, but I've had the opportunity to participate in wonderful sessions here at the Yari Yari and Tuaso conference. I've visited Elmina Castle, which, of course, for a person of African descent in the United States is an extremely moving experience. And then I had the opportunity to visit the Du Bois Center, where I spoke with a group of people who represented, I think, the university, and there were young students and community people and people from the conference. It's actually been a very exciting trip, and I keep asking myself, why has it taken me so many years to make it to Ghana? I should have come here decades ago. But I'm also happy that I'm here at this moment, because there appears to be a great deal of excitement now.
Now, you are an avid writer yourself. Can you share with us some of your influences and motivations in writing?
Well, the very first published piece I wrote was an article on black women slaves. It was called The Role of Black Women in the Community of Slaves. And I wrote that when I was in jail. And I wrote it largely in response to developments within the Black liberation movement at that time, when there were those who were arguing that that women were attempting to play too powerful a role in the movement, and that women should step back and allow the men to move forward. And so it's interesting that the piece that I wrote about women slaves was really about women who were active in the movement for liberation in the 1960s and 1970s.
Now, you've been involved in the liberation struggle of the 60s and 70s a lot. How have your personal challenges and these struggles that you've gone to, being in jail and all that, shaped your outlook, your general outlook on life?
Well, of course, the one major event in my life that in many ways shaped all of the last 40 years was the fact that I was arrested in 1970, falsely charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. And I faced the death penalty. I faced capital punishment 3 times. Had it not been for the fact that people all over the world, including on the continent of Africa, and especially many people here in Ghana, had it not been for the fact that they joined the international campaign for my freedom, I might be sitting in jail today. So I believe so strongly in the power of collective movements to achieve the impossible. As I've said, at that time, I was up against the three major figures in the government of the United States, some of the most reactionary, most repressive figures. Richard Nixon was the president. Ronald Reagan was the governor. J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, and they were all determined to see me marched into the gas chamber. And so many people who knew that I was not guilty said that there's no way that we can win this fight. However, there were those who committed themselves to doing the organizing and building a movement that spread all over the world. And in the end, we were far more powerful than they.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit about your work in the liberation struggle. Living through the, late 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, witnessing firsthand the civil rights movement in the United States and later the liberation struggle on the African continent. I mean, when you look back, what is the feeling like?
Well, when I look back at those struggles, I am impressed by my memory of the extent to which they were inextricably connected. I remember the civil rights movement, of course, but there was also the struggle against apartheid, the beginnings of the struggle against apartheid. I remember growing up in the most segregated city of the United States, Birmingham, Alabama, and learning about South Africa because people said we lived in the Johannesburg of the South. And then, of course, as an activist in the Black Liberation Movement, who did we read? We read Nkrumah. Of course, we read Du Bois. We read Frantz Fanon. We were inspired by Amilcar Cabral. So I can't distinguish between our struggle within the United States and what was going on the continent. It was an internationalism that inspired us. We were convinced that it was possible to win a revolution in the United States because, after all, Ghana had achieved its independence, and in Cuba they had achieved a revolution 90 miles from the shores of the U.S. So it was an era during which internationalism was prominent. And I sometimes regret that we don't have that same sense of connectedness today, although, of course, this is another era, and we have to build it anew in a different way.
Now, you've mentioned, some great leaders who helped in the liberation struggle, the likes of Nkrumah, Du Bois. You can go on to mention Luther King, Malcolm X, and so on. Do you think that we've been able to consolidate on the gains that these people achieved during their time?
Well, what I've learned is that history never proceeds in a straight line. We often tend to think of progress as linear, but in reality, we achieve victories, and then we're pushed back. Oftentimes we forget that if we don't protect those victories, that they will be elusive. And so in many ways we've been able to build on those struggles and those victories. But in many other ways, we're in a much worse situation than ever. As a matter of fact, while people talk about a post-racial society in the U.S., because after all, we have a black president, right? But many of us argue that racism is worse in the United States than it was when the civil rights movement emerged. And it's a structural racism that many people fail to recognize because they think of racism as something that's individual and not inscribed in the structures of the economy of the society.
So even with all the gains and the U.S. having a black president, you're still insisting that there are institutional forms of racism still prevalent in modern day U.S.?
Well, of course, there are 2.5 million people behind bars. The vast majority of them are black. The overwhelming majority are people of color. Black women constitute the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. And imprisonment has become profitable. So we have something that we call a prison industrial complex now that is so fueled by racism, not only in the U.S., but all over the world. You go into prisons in France, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, and who do you discover in those prisons? Generally, you see black people, African people, you see people from the Arab countries, and this is a racism that we have not yet figured out how to talk about, how to have a global conversation about. And what is even more distressing is that these institutions, these prisons, have emerged to catch the surplus population that is produced by global capitalism. People who can no longer find a place in societies that have dramatically transformed because everything is privatized and everything is about profit. And so prisons are there as a kind of garbage bin to catch people in Africa, in Europe, in the U.S., who have not been able to find a place in this new world that is so mastered by global capitalism.
Now, I mean, earlier you made reference to the disconnect, generally between Africans in mainland Africa and people of African descent in the diaspora. How has this hampered efforts to, emancipate, black people across the globe?
Well, of course, there have been efforts to produce progressive anti-imperialist Pan-Africanisms for a long time. And the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois, and we call him Du Bois because that's what he called himself. I know many people say Du Bois, but he's buried here, and that is a symbol of that unity. Not for the sake of unity, but for the sake of struggle, struggling against imperialism. And so I think there's still some powerful ways in which we can imagine it today. This is a writers' conference, an organization of women writers of African descent. And I think many writers and artists have a way of imagining that unity that will allow us to perhaps craft political strategies to produce that unity. In the 21st century, it's going to look different. It's not going to be the same. But it is perhaps more necessary today than ever before. And I'm a person who likes to emphasize the hope and the optimism. And I see a great deal of hope, a great deal of optimism in younger generations, a desire really to make those connections. And given the fact that we have new technologies that allows us to speak to each other in ways that were never possible in the past, ought to be an inspiration to recraft this unity.
Right. Now, earlier you also made a mention of the fact that racism still pertains in the U.S. even today. Now, back here in Ghana, it is often opined that even though we were probably the first country south of the Sahara to gain political independence, economic independence is yet to be fully achieved now, and the same goes for other parts of the continent. What do you think that African governments can really do to set a path towards extricating themselves from the dependency syndrome, especially on the West, which has occasioned this?
Well, I don't have a lot of trust in governments by themselves. I think that the real hope resides in people, in masses of people organizing. And so, just as I can't deposit my hope in a black president in the United States, but what I can say is that if we organize movements to put pressure on Obama, we can achieve, some of the goals that are so necessary in this era. And I would say exactly the same thing about countries in Africa. It's the people who have to do the work.
Certain names keep coming up, the likes of Nkrumah, Dubois, and others. These were names which were identified with a, struggle. But in contemporary times, there seems to be a general, lack of, identifiable figures. Do you think this has in any way affected the struggle?
Well, of course, we often tend to assume that struggles require heroic individuals, because we do think about the Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X's, we think about the Nkrumahs, we think about the Mandelas. But as a matter of fact, the movements are always movements of masses of people. And leaders emerge out of those movements. The best leaders are leaders who understand that they do not produce movements, but rather they are produced by movements. And so I'm not that concerned about the fact that we have no recognizable figures today. I'm more concerned about the fact that we need to organize the movements, and the leaders will organically emerge from those movements. Dr. Martin Luther King was an unknown pastor, 26-year-old pastor who had not really done very much at all when he was asked by the women who organized the Montgomery bus boycott to represent them. It was the women who did the real work, who enabled the emergence of that movement. So in a sense, we have to learn how to recognize who is really responsible for historical change. And oftentimes, it's masses of people whose names we do not know. Oftentimes, it's women who are erased by the historical records.
Finally, looking forward, what do you see as the way forward for a concerted effort to galvanize, this energy of all the people in Africa and the diaspora to achieve the goals that we set out many years ago?
Well, the point that I always make is that corporations have, in fact, co-opted a lot of the strategies and the terminology and the vocabulary. And so they talk about diversity in the corporate boardrooms. And so they seek black members of their boards. They seek women CEOs. And the point that I always make is that that kind of diversity is difference that doesn't make a difference. So what we need is social justice. What we need is a more radical perspective. Yeah, that was clearly a mistake. I've never been one to insist that the revolutions are happening in the corporate boardrooms. As a matter of fact, quite the contrary.
Right. Now, we're still talking about a disconnect between Africans and those in the diaspora. And especially, where you see Israeli Americans, maintaining ties with Israelis back in their homeland. You see Latin Americans maintaining ties, even Italian Americans. But, it is often opined that the black community within, especially the U.S. and other countries in the West are not united themselves. Do you share this opinion?
Well, I don't think it's possible for all black people to unite. And it's precisely because some black people have really benefited from the civil rights struggles and have made it as individuals into positions of power. And some are trying to use those positions of power to change the community, but there are many others who are only interested in themselves as individuals. And so they become a part of the apparatus that encourages racism even. So we can't imagine black unity in the way we used to during the era of segregation. But I think that we can, look back towards a kind of Pan-Africanism that was represented by Nkrumah and Du Bois, a kind of unity in struggle. But that would also involve not only expressing solidarity with people on the African continent, it would involve expressing solidarity with Palestinians, for example, against Israel, and recognizing that just as black people in the U.S. played a really important role in the anti-apartheid solidarity movement with respect to South Africa during the 1980s, we should be doing the same thing with respect to apartheid in Israel, and we should be forging solidarity for our Palestinian sisters and brothers. So I see that unity is political, and it is not confined to racialized communities, but it's about solidarity with those who are victims of settler colonialism and of imperialism today.